The airplane cabin was quiet except for the usual sounds of passengers settling in. David Roberts sank into seat 1A with a tired sigh, grateful for a few hours of peace. It had been one of those weeks that felt more like a month. Back-to-back meetings, barely any sleep, and now finally he could just close his eyes and breathe. He was dressed simply. Comfortable jeans, a gray hoodie, and his favorite worn sneakers. At 52 years old, he had learned that comfort mattered more than impressing strangers on a plane. His carry-on bag was tucked under the seat in front of him, and he was already thinking about the nap he was going to take once they were in the air. David pulled out his phone to send a quick text to his wife. "Boarding now. See you tonight. Love you." He hit send and glanced around the first-class cabin. The usual crowd. Business travelers in pressed suits. A few people already typing away on laptops, someone reading the Wall Street Journal. Normal Friday afternoon flight stuff. He had just closed his eyes when he heard footsteps stop right next to his seat. David opened one eye and saw a flight attendant standing there. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, with blonde hair pulled back tight in a bun. Her name tag read Jennifer. Her smile was there, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice polite but with an edge to it. "May I see your boarding pass?" David nodded and reached into his hoodie pocket, pulling out his phone to show his mobile boarding pass. No big deal. They checked sometimes. He held it up for her to see. Jennifer took his phone, and David noticed how carefully she looked at it. Not a quick glance. A real examination. Her eyes went from the screen to his face, then back to the screen. Then she looked around at the other passengers in first class. David felt something uncomfortable stir in his stomach. He knew that look. "Sir, I think there might be a problem with your ticket," Jennifer said, her voice a bit louder now. A few people in nearby seats turned to look. "What kind of problem?" David asked, keeping his voice calm and even. He had learned a long time ago that getting upset only made things worse. Jennifer handed back his phone. "This seat is in first class. Are you sure you didn't mean to book economy? It's an easy mistake to make." David felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his expression neutral. "No mistake. I booked first class. That's my seat." "Well, sometimes the app can glitch," Jennifer continued, still smiling that tight smile. "If you could just come with me to the back, we can sort this out with the gate agent before we take off." Other passengers were definitely watching now. David could feel their eyes on him. A businessman across the aisle had looked up from his newspaper. An older woman 2 rows back had paused mid-conversation with her seatmate. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, like the walls were closing in. "There's nothing to sort out," David said, his voice still calm but firmer now. "I paid for this seat." "I'm in the right place." Jennifer's smile disappeared. She straightened up, her shoulders going back. "Sir, I need you to cooperate. This is a first-class cabin, and I need to verify that all passengers are in their correct seats." "You can verify," David said. "My boarding pass shows seat 1A. I'm sitting in seat 1A. Everything is correct." A man in seat 2B leaned forward. He was older, probably in his 60s, wearing an expensive-looking suit. "I saw his boarding pass," the man said to Jennifer. "It said first class, seat 1A. He's in the right spot." Jennifer barely glanced at him. "Thank you, sir, but this is crew business." She turned her attention back to David. "I'm going to need to call my supervisor." David nodded slowly. "Go ahead." He watched as Jennifer walked quickly toward the front of the plane, her shoes clicking against the floor. She grabbed a phone mounted near the cockpit and spoke into it quietly, but David could see her gesturing back toward his seat. Other flight attendants glanced his way. The whispers were starting now. He could hear fragments of conversations from other passengers. "What's going on?" "I don't know, something about his ticket." "Poor guy, that's embarrassing." David pulled out his phone again and opened his email. There it was. His receipt. First-class ticket, paid in full 3 weeks ago. He took a screenshot just in case. Then he did something else. He opened his camera and set it to record video, placing the phone on his lap, lens facing up. If this was going where he thought it was going, he wanted a record. The businessman across the aisle caught his eye and gave him a sympathetic look. "This is ridiculous," the man said quietly. "You shouldn't have to deal with this." David gave him a small nod of thanks but didn't say anything. He had been here before. Not on a plane exactly, but in enough situations to know how this worked. The assumptions people made when they saw him. The way his casual clothes suddenly meant something different on his body than they would on someone else. The way first class and his face didn't seem to match in some people's minds. A minute later, Jennifer returned, and this time she wasn't alone. A man in his 40s walked beside her, wearing the uniform of a senior flight attendant. His name tag said Greg, and he had supervisor written underneath his name. He had that air about him, the kind of person who was used to being in charge and having people listen. Greg stopped at David's seat and looked down at him with an expression that was somewhere between annoyance and suspicion. He didn't ask to see a boarding pass. He didn't check anything on a tablet or computer. He just stood there, arms crossed. "Sir, we have a situation here," Greg said, his voice loud enough that everyone in first class could hear clearly. "We need to resolve this before we can take off." "What situation?" David asked. "I'm a ticketed passenger in my assigned seat." "Jennifer has expressed concerns about your ticket," Greg said. "We need you to move to your correct seat so we can get this flight in the air on time." "I am in my correct seat," David repeated. He could feel his heart beating faster now, that mix of anger and something else, hurt maybe, or just exhaustion with having to prove himself over and over again. "Sir, I'm not going to ask again," Greg said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "If you don't move voluntarily, I will have security remove you from this aircraft. You will be banned from flying with this airline. Is that what you want?" The cabin had gone completely silent now. Every single person was watching. Some had their phones out. David could see at least 3 people recording. That was something, at least. Witnesses. David looked up at Greg, then at Jennifer standing behind him with her arms crossed. He thought about standing up, about causing a scene, about demanding to speak to someone higher up. But he also knew how those things went. An angry black man on an airplane. Security would come. Things would escalate. He might end up in handcuffs or worse on the news for all the wrong reasons. So instead, he stayed seated. He kept his voice level and calm. "I'm not moving. I've paid for this seat. I'm not breaking any rules. But please do call security. Let's make sure everyone sees what's happening here." He gestured slightly to the phones recording around the cabin. Greg's face flushed red. His hand went to the radio on his belt. And that's when everything changed. Greg's finger was already pressing the button on his radio when a voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Wait!" Everyone turned. A young woman had stood up from seat 3C. She was in her late 20s wearing a navy blue business suit, her hair pulled back professionally. She looked furious, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. But there was something else in her expression, too. Recognition. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" she said, her voice shaking slightly but strong. She was looking directly at Greg and Jennifer. Greg lowered his radio, irritation flashing across his face. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you. Please sit down." "It absolutely concerns me," the young woman said, taking a step into the aisle. "That man you're about to throw off this plane? That's Dr. David Roberts. He's the chief of cardiothoracic surgery at Memorial Hospital." David closed his eyes briefly. He hadn't wanted this. Hadn't wanted to use his title like some kind of shield. But the young woman kept going, and he could hear the anger and disbelief in her voice. "I'm a surgical resident," she continued. "I work with him. Do you understand what you're doing right now?" Jennifer's confident expression faltered for just a second. Greg, however, looked skeptical. "That's very nice, ma'am, but it doesn't change the situation. Now please sit down, or you'll be removed from this flight as well." "He saved your CEO's life," the young woman said, pulling out her phone. "Last year. Daniel Reeves. Your actual boss. There was an emergency on a flight, and Dr. Roberts performed surgery right there in the aisle. It was all over the news. You really don't remember?" A murmur rippled through the cabin. Several passengers immediately grabbed their phones. David could see fingers flying over screens, people typing and searching. He sat very still, his hands folded in his lap, watching this unfold like he was outside his own body. The businessman across the aisle spoke up again. "I remember that story. It was huge news. The surgeon who saved someone's life mid-flight." "Oh my God," a woman from row 4 said, staring at her phone. "It is him, look." She turned her phone around, showing the people next to her. "That's the same guy. That's Dr. Roberts." More phones came out. More searching. David could hear the whispers growing louder, spreading through the cabin like wildfire. "I read about this," someone else said. "He's like one of the top heart surgeons in the country. Didn't he win some kind of award?" Greg's face had gone from red to pale in a matter of seconds. He pulled out his own phone with shaking hands, and David watched as the supervisor typed quickly, his eyes scanning whatever came up on his screen. Jennifer leaned over to look, and the color drained from her face too. The search results must have been pretty clear, because there was David's face, staring back at them from dozens of articles. Not just the story about saving the CEO, though that was definitely there, but other things too, awards he'd received, papers he'd published, the charity work he did, his position at one of the most respected hospitals in the country, and probably, if they scrolled far enough, they'd see his status with the airline. Over 2 million miles flown, Platinum Elite member for the past 8 years, one of their most frequent customers. Greg's hand holding the phone dropped to his side. He looked at David, then at Jennifer, then back at David. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. "So," the young resident said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence, "are you still going to call security? Are you still going to throw him off the plane for sitting in the seat he paid for?" Before Greg could respond, movement came from the front of the plane. The cockpit door opened and the captain stepped out. He was a Hispanic man, probably in his mid-50s, with graying hair and the kind of presence that comes from years of experience. His uniform was crisp, his expression serious as he took in the scene before him. "What's going on out here?" Irie asked. "We should have pushed back 5 minutes ago." His eyes scanned the cabin, taking in the standing resident, the passengers with their phones out, Greg and Jennifer looking like they wanted the floor to swallow them whole. Then his eyes landed on David and something changed in his expression. "Dr. Roberts?" The captain's face broke into a smile, and he walked quickly down the aisle, his hand extended. "I didn't know you were on my flight." "It's an honor, sir." David stood up and shook the captain's hand. "Captain Rodriguez," he said, reading the name tag. "Good to meet you." "The honor is mine," Captain Rodriguez said warmly. "My father had triple bypass surgery last year. You performed it. He's doing great now, back to playing golf and driving my mother crazy." He laughed, a genuine sound that felt strange against the tension in the cabin. Then the captain seemed to notice that tension. His smile faded. He looked at Greg, at Jennifer, at the phone still recording. "Somebody want to tell me what's happening here?" The businessman from seat 2B didn't hesitate. "Your crew just tried to force Dr. Roberts out of his seat, told him he didn't belong in first class, threatened to have him removed from the plane and banned from the airline." Captain Rodriguez went very still. His expression shifted from confusion to understanding to something that looked a lot like rage, though he kept it tightly controlled. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but somehow that made it more frightening than if he'd yelled. "Is this true?" Greg seemed to have lost the ability to speak. Jennifer looked at the floor. "I asked you a question," Captain Rodriguez said. "Did you attempt to remove a passenger from his paid seat because you assumed he didn't belong there?" "We thought there was a mistake with his ticket," Jennifer finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you check his ticket?" "Yes, but did it show seat 1A? "Yes, but we thought—" "You thought what exactly?" The captain's voice had an edge now that could have cut glass. "You thought a black man in comfortable clothes couldn't possibly afford first class? Is that what you thought?" The words hung in the air. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the passengers who had been recording seemed frozen, their phones still pointed at the scene, but their faces showing shock at how directly the captain had named what everyone had been thinking but not quite saying. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't mean— I don't want to hear it," Captain Rodriguez cut her off. He turned to David. "Dr. Roberts, I cannot apologize enough. This is absolutely unacceptable." David nodded slowly. He appreciated the captain's words, but the exhaustion was setting in now. The adrenaline that had kept him calm was fading and he just felt tired. So tired. "Captain, can we just get this flight in the air?" David asked quietly. "I'd really like to go home." "Of course." Captain Rodriguez turned to Greg and Jennifer. "You two come with me, now." He gestured toward the front of the plane, and both crew members followed him like children being sent to the principal's office. The captain spoke into his radio as they walked. calling for replacement crew members. The cabin was buzzing now with conversation. The young resident caught David's eye and gave him a small smile before sitting back down. The businessman across the aisle shook his head in disgust. Other passengers were typing frantically on their phones, probably posting about what they'd just witnessed on social media. David sat back down in seat 1A. His hands were shaking slightly now, and he clasped them together to steady them. He'd been in situations like this before, but never quite this public, never quite this humiliating. And the worst part was knowing that his credentials, his title, his work saving the CEO, those were the things that had saved him, not his humanity, not the basic principle that he was a paying customer who deserved respect. What about all the other black men and women who didn't have fancy titles? What happened to them when they faced this kind of treatment? Who stood up for them? The flight attendants that Greg and Jennifer had called for replacements arrived within minutes. They were professional, courteous, apologizing quietly to David and making sure every passenger felt comfortable. They didn't make a scene. They just did their jobs the way they should have been done from the beginning. But David knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Those phones that had recorded everything? Those videos were probably already uploading to the internet. By the time this plane landed, the whole world was going to know what had happened on Flight 447, and David had a decision to make about what he was going to do about it. The plane finally pushed back from the gate 28 minutes late. David sat with his eyes closed, headphones in, but he wasn't really listening to music. He was just trying to create a bubble of space around himself, trying to process what had just happened. His phone kept buzzing in his pocket. Text messages, probably. His wife, his colleagues, maybe his kids. Word traveled fast, and he was sure someone on this plane had already posted something online, but he couldn't deal with that yet. He just needed a moment to breathe. The new flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency. A different woman, older with kind eyes, stopped at his seat. "Dr. Roberts, can I get you anything? Water, coffee, something stronger?" David opened his eyes and managed a small smile. "Water would be great, thank you." She returned quickly with a bottle of water and a glass of ice. "I'm Patricia," she said quietly. "I'm so sorry for what happened. That should never have occurred." "Thank you," David said, meaning it. Her apology felt genuine, not like she was just covering for the airline. As the plane taxied toward the runway, David finally pulled out his phone. 43 messages. He scrolled through them quickly. His wife had sent several, starting with confusion and escalating to worry. His daughter had texted saying she'd seen something on Twitter. His colleague from the hospital had forwarded him a link with just one word. Wow. David clicked the link. It opened to a Twitter post that already had over 10,000 retweets. The video was shaky, but clear enough. There he was, sitting calmly, in his seat while Jennifer and Greg stood over him, their voices caught perfectly by someone's phone microphone. "If you don't move voluntarily, I will have security remove you from this aircraft." The comments section was exploding. Some people were outraged. Some were sharing their own similar experiences. A few were trying to defend the flight attendants, saying there must be more to the story. But those comments were getting drowned out by the sheer volume of people who saw exactly what had happened and exactly why it had happened. David put his phone face down on his lap. His hands were still shaking slightly. The businessman across the aisle leaned over. "Hey, I'm Richard," he said, keeping his voice low. "I just want you to know that was completely out of line. I've seen a lot of things on planes, but that was something else." "Appreciate it," David said. "I run a consulting firm," Richard continued. "We do a lot of diversity and inclusion training for corporations. I'm going to make sure my team sees what happened here today. This is exactly the kind of implicit bias we try to address." David nodded. He'd heard the term implicit bias 100 times, had sat through training sessions himself at the hospital, but knowing the academic term for something didn't make it easier when you were the one experiencing it, when you were the one being judged before you even opened your mouth. The plane lifted off the ground, and David felt that familiar sensation of leaving Earth behind. If only he could leave the last hour behind with it. About 20 minutes into the flight after the seatbelt sign had turned off, something unexpected happened. The young resident from seat 3C walked up the aisle and stopped at David's seat. Up close he could see she was nervous, fidgeting with her phone. "Dr. Roberts, I'm sorry for calling you out like that," she said quietly. "I know you probably didn't want me to make a big deal about who you are." David looked up at her. She had dark circles under her eyes, the kind every resident had. He remembered those years, the exhaustion, the constant pressure. "What's your name?" he asked. "Dr. Chen, Kimberly Chen. I'm in my second year of surgical residency." "Sit down for a minute, Dr. Chen," David said, gesturing to the empty seat next to him. The passenger who had booked it hadn't shown up. Kimberly sat perched on the edge of the seat like she might need to bolt at any moment. "You didn't do anything wrong," David told her. "I appreciate you speaking up." "But that's just it," Kimberly said, her words coming out in a rush. "You shouldn't have needed me to speak up. You shouldn't have needed your title or your credentials. You should have been treated with respect just because you're a human being who paid for a seat." David felt something loosen in his chest. This young resident, probably half his age, understood exactly what had bothered him most about the whole situation. "That's exactly right," he said quietly. "I'm Asian American," Kimberly continued. "I've had people assume I'm a nurse instead of a doctor. I've had patients refuse treatment from me because of how I look, so I get it at least a little bit. But what happened to you today, that was on a whole different level." They sat in silence for a moment. David took a sip of his water. "Can I ask you something?" Kimberly said. "Sure. What are you going to do?" "About what happened?" "Because those videos are everywhere now. I checked my phone before takeoff. It's trending on 3 different social media platforms." David had been thinking about that exact question since the moment Captain Rodriguez had escorted Greg and Jennifer off the plane. What was he going to do? He could stay quiet, let the airline handle it internally. Go home, go back to work, pretend it never happened. That was probably the easiest path. The one that wouldn't make waves. But then he thought about every other person who had faced this kind of treatment and didn't have a title to hide behind. Didn't have a story about saving a CEO's life. Didn't have 2 million airline miles or a colleague who happened to be on the same flight. What happened to them? They probably got kicked off the plane. Probably got banned from the airline. Probably went home humiliated and defeated with no recourse, no justice, nothing. "I don't know yet," David admitted. "Part of me just wants to forget about it. But I keep thinking about all the people this has happened to who couldn't defend themselves." Kimberly nodded. "Whatever you decide, a lot of people are going to be watching. For what it's worth, I think you have a chance to make a real difference here." She stood up, gave him a small smile, and headed back to her seat. The flight continued. Patricia came by a few more times, making sure David had everything he needed without being overbearing. Other passengers kept glancing his way, some sympathetic, some curious, but nobody else approached him. Richard across the aisle gave him a nod every now and then, a silent show of solidarity. David tried to read a book on his tablet but couldn't concentrate. His mind kept replaying the scene. Jennifer's tight smile, Greg's aggressive stance, the assumption written across both their faces that he didn't belong, that he was trying to pull something over on them, that a black man in a hoodie couldn't possibly be a legitimate first-class passenger. He'd worked so hard to get where he was. Decades of school training, building a career. He'd saved countless lives, mentored dozens of young doctors, contributed to medical research that had helped thousands of patients, and still to 2 people who didn't know him. All of that meant nothing compared to the color of his skin. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. And David was tired of pretending that these moments didn't cut deep, didn't leave scars that piled up over the years. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a call. David looked at the caller ID and felt his stomach drop. It was Robert Morrison, the CEO of the airline. The same man whose life David had saved last year when he'd had a heart attack at 30,000 feet. David hesitated, then answered. "Hello? David, it's Robert Morrison. I just heard what happened on your flight, and I cannot tell you how horrified I am." The CEO's voice was tight with emotion. David could hear genuine distress there, not just corporate damage control. "I'm on the plane right now," David said. "We're in the air. I know. I had them patch me through." "David, listen to me. What happened was completely unacceptable. I've already spoken with our head of operations. The 2 employees involved have been suspended pending a full investigation. David closed his eyes. Robert, this isn't just about 2 employees. I know that, Morrison said quickly. I know it's bigger than that, and I want to make this right. When you land, there's going to be someone from our executive team waiting to speak with you. But more importantly, I want to sit down with you personally. I want to hear what you think we should do, how we can fix this, how we can make sure it never happens again. I appreciate that, David said, and he did. But he also knew that corporate promises were easy to make and hard to keep. You saved my life, Morrison continued, his voice cracking slightly. I owe you everything. And this is how my company treated you? It's inexcusable. After the call ended, David sat back and stared out the window at the clouds below. The CEO's call had been genuine, he believed that. But this wasn't about personal favors or IOUs. This was about systematic change. His phone buzzed with another text. This time from his daughter. Dad, you're all over the news. Are you okay? Should I call you? David texted back. On the plane. We'll call when I land. I'm fine. Love you. But he wasn't sure if that was true. Was he fine? Or was he just so used to this kind of thing that he'd learned to function through it? The captain's voice came over the intercom. Folks, we're about 40 minutes from landing in Chicago. Weather looks good. 40 minutes. And then David would have to decide what came next. The wheels hit the runway with a gentle thud, and David felt the familiar deceleration as the plane slowed down. Through his window, he could see the Chicago skyline in the distance, the late afternoon sun painting everything in shades of gold and orange. Home, almost. As soon as the seatbelt sign dinged off, the cabin erupted in the usual chaos of people standing up, pulling luggage from overhead bins, checking phones that had been switched to airplane mode. David stayed seated in no rush to join the crowd. Patricia, the flight attendant who had been so kind to him, appeared at his seat one more time. Dr. Roberts, the captain asked if you wouldn't mind waiting just a moment after everyone else deplanes. There are some people who'd like to speak with you. David nodded. He'd been expecting something like this. The other passengers filed out slowly. Some of them glanced his way as they passed. A few smiled sympathetically. One older woman actually stopped and touched his shoulder gently. God bless you, she said simply, and kept walking. Richard, the businessman from across the aisle, paused as he pulled down his carry-on. Take care of yourself, he said. And if you need anything, a witness statement, whatever, here's my card. He handed David a business card with his contact information. Thank you, David said, tucking the card into his pocket. Kimberly Chen was one of the last to leave. She gave him a small wave and mouthed good luck before disappearing down the aisle. When the cabin was finally empty except for the crew, Captain Rodriguez emerged from the cockpit. Behind him came a woman in a sharp business suit, probably in her early 50s, with graying hair and an expression that was equal parts professional and genuinely concerned. Dr. Roberts, I'm Linda Hayes, the Regional Director of Customer Relations for the airline, she said, extending her hand. First, I want to apologize personally for what you experienced today. It was unacceptable, and it doesn't represent who we are as a company. David shook her hand but said nothing. He'd heard apologies before. Words were easy. I know you've already spoken with Mr. Morrison, Linda continued. He's asked me to ensure that you're taken care of, and that we have a full understanding of what happened. Would you be willing to speak with me? I have a private office at the airport, or we can arrange a car to take you wherever you'd like, and we can speak at a time that's convenient for you. David looked at his watch. It was almost 6 in the evening. His wife was expecting him home for dinner. His son was probably already there, having driven in from college for the weekend. He wanted nothing more than to leave this airport and put this whole day behind him. But he also knew that if he walked away now, if he let the airline handle this quietly behind closed doors, nothing would really change. The same thing would happen to someone else, maybe next week, maybe tomorrow. Someone who didn't have his platform or his connections. We can talk now, David said, but I have some conditions. Linda pulled out a notepad. Of course. Whatever you need. This conversation gets recorded. I want a full transcript, and whatever comes out of this, whatever actions the airline decides to take, it needs to be public. No sweeping it under the rug. Linda hesitated for just a fraction of a second, but then nodded. Agreed. They moved to a small conference room in the airport's administrative section. It was sterile and cold, with gray walls and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly sick. A pitcher of water sat on the table along with some glasses and a box of tissues that David hoped he wouldn't need but appreciated anyway. Linda set up a recording device in the center of the table and stated the date, time, and who was present for the record. Then she looked at David with eyes that seemed genuinely troubled. "Tell me what happened from your perspective." So David did. He walked through the entire incident, from the moment he'd settled into his seat to Jennifer's suspicious looks, Greg's threats, the intervention from Kimberly and Captain Rodriguez. He kept his voice level and factual, trying not to let emotion bleed into the account even though it was there, simmering under the surface. Linda took notes as he spoke, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "Did they ever actually check your boarding pass against the airline system?" "No," David said. "Jennifer looked at my phone, looked at me, and decided there was a problem. She never scanned it or verified it with anyone." "And at what point did they threaten to have you removed?" "When I refused to move to economy. Greg said security would remove me and I'd be banned from the airline." Linda's pen pressed harder against her notepad. "I'm so sorry," she said again. And this time David could hear something break in her voice. "This should never have happened. We have protocols specifically designed to prevent this kind of racial profiling." "Then your protocols failed," David said quietly, "or your staff ignored them. Either way, the result is the same." "You're absolutely right." Linda looked down at her notes for a moment, then back up at David. "Can I ask you something? And please be completely honest. What would make this right? What do you need from us?" David had been thinking about this question during the entire flight. What did he need? An apology? He'd gotten several of those. Money? He didn't need it, and taking a payout felt like accepting hush money. His job back if he'd been fired? He'd never been at risk of losing his job. "I need to know that this won't happen to someone else," David finally said. "I need real change, not just another training video that people sleep through. I need accountability." "What does accountability look like to you?" David leaned forward. "Jennifer and Greg, they made a choice today based on their assumptions about who I am. Those assumptions were rooted in racism, whether conscious or unconscious. That has consequences. They should face those consequences." Linda nodded slowly. "They've been suspended pending a full investigation. Based on what I've seen and heard, including the videos that are now circulating online, I believe termination is likely." "That's a start," David said. "But it's not enough. I want to see mandatory training for all staff, real training that actually addresses bias. I want to see clear reporting mechanisms so when this happens to others, they have recourse. I want diverse hiring at all levels, especially in management positions where decisions get made about policy and discipline." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "And I want a scholarship fund for students of color pursuing careers in aviation, hospitality, any field where they'll interact with the public. Because representation matters. If Greg and Jennifer had worked alongside more black colleagues, if they'd seen black people in positions of authority in their own company, maybe they wouldn't have made the assumptions they did." Linda was writing furiously. "These are excellent suggestions. I'm going to personally take this to Mr. Morrison and the board of directors." "Make it public," David said again. "Don't hide what happened. Don't bury it in some internal memo. Own it, apologize publicly, show people what you're going to do differently." "That's going to be difficult," Linda admitted. "Our legal team will probably advise against it." "Then your legal team is thinking about protecting the company instead of doing the right thing," David said. His voice was firm now, no longer tired. "Those videos are already out there. The story is already breaking. You can either get ahead of it and show leadership, or you can look like you're trying to cover it up. Which do you think is better for the company in the long run?" Linda was quiet for a moment, then she let out a long breath. "You're right. You're absolutely right." They talked for another 30 minutes, going over details, discussing possibilities. Linda asked if David would be willing to consult with the airline on their diversity initiatives, and he said he'd consider it, but wanted to see their initial response first. Finally, Linda stood up. "Dr. Roberts, thank you for your time and your patience. I know you just wanted to get home. I'm going to have a car take you wherever you need to go, and I'm going to personally follow up with you within 48 hours with a detailed plan of action." "I'll be waiting," David said. As he walked out of the conference room, David pulled out his phone. 67 new messages now. The story had exploded while he'd been in the meeting. News outlets were calling for statements. His hospital's PR department wanted to know how to handle media inquiries. His wife had called 3 times. He dialed her number as he walked through the terminal toward the exit. David? Oh, thank God. Are you okay? I've been so worried. Just hearing her voice made something in David's chest loosen. I'm okay, honey. Tired, but okay. I'm getting in a car now. I'll be home soon. What happened? I saw the videos. I can't believe they treated you like that. I'll tell you everything when I get home, David promised. Is Kevin there? Yes, he's here. We've been watching the news together. David, everyone's talking about this. It's everywhere. I know, David said. He could see the car Linda had arranged pulling up to the curb. A driver got out and opened the back door. I'm going to deal with it. But right now I just want to come home and have dinner with my family. We'll be waiting, his wife said. I love you. Love you too. David ended the call and slid into the back seat of the car. As the driver pulled away from the airport, David looked back at the terminal building, its windows reflecting the last light of the sunset. Somewhere in there, Jennifer and Greg were probably being questioned, their careers likely over. Captain Rodriguez was probably writing up his report. Patricia and the other flight attendants were preparing for their next flights. And somewhere out there, someone else was probably boarding a plane, settling into their seat, and hoping they wouldn't be judged for the color of their skin. David closed his eyes and rested his head against the seat. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. But for now, for the next 30 minutes of this car ride, he was going to let himself just be tired. David's house was warm and bright when he finally walked through the door. The smell of his wife's cooking filled the air, something with garlic and herbs that made his stomach growl. He hadn't realized how hungry he was until that moment. Dad! His son Kevin practically ran to the door, pulling him into a tight hug. At 21, Kevin was taller than David now. But in that moment, he felt like the little boy who used to wait by the window for his father to come home. Hey, son, David said, hugging him back just as tight. His wife Rachel appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. Her eyes were red and David knew she'd been crying. She didn't say anything, just walked over and wrapped her arms around him. They stood like that for a long moment, the 3 of them together in the entryway. I'm okay, David said quietly. Really, I'm okay. Rachel pulled back and looked at him, her hands on his face. No, you're not. But you will be. They ate dinner together at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd shared thousands of meals over the years. Rachel had made David's favorite pot roast with roasted vegetables. Kevin kept his phone face down on the table, resisting the urge to check it, which David appreciated. So what happens now? Kevin asked, pushing peas around his plate. I don't know exactly, David admitted. The airline is launching an investigation. They're talking about making changes. We'll see if they actually follow through. The videos have millions of views already, Kevin said. My friends are all sharing it. People are really angry about what happened to you. David nodded. He'd seen some of the reactions during the car ride home. The outrage, the support, but also the uglier comments from people who insisted there must be more to the story, who found ways to blame him or minimize what had happened. Your phone's been ringing non-stop, Rachel said. News stations, reporters, even some talk shows. Everyone wants to interview you. David cut into his pot roast, watching the steam rise from the tender meat. I figured. Are you going to do any of them? She asked. Maybe. Probably. I don't know yet. He looked up at his wife and son. I keep thinking about what good it would do. If I stay quiet, the story dies down in a few days and nothing changes. But if I speak up, if I use whatever attention this is getting, maybe something actually shifts. Kevin leaned forward. Then you should do it, Dad. You should tell your story. It's not just my story, though, David said. That's what's been bothering me all day. Yes, it happened to me. But it happens to so many people. Black people, brown people, anyone who doesn't fit what someone expects to see in a certain place. I don't want this to be about poor Dr. Roberts who got mistreated. I want it to be about the bigger problem. Rachel reached across the table and took his hand. Then make it about that. You've never been afraid to speak truth before. Don't start now. After dinner, David went up to his study. It was his quiet place, lined with medical books and journals with photos of his family covering one wall. Awards and certificates hung on another, but he barely noticed them anymore. They were just part of the background. He sat at his desk and opened his laptop. His email inbox was overflowing. He scrolled through, seeing messages from colleagues, former patients, friends from medical school he hadn't spoken to in years. One email caught his eye. It was from a young man named Terrell, who wrote that he'd been kicked off a bus last month for being suspicious, and nobody had recorded it. Nobody had stood up for him, and he'd just accepted it as part of life. "Thank you for not staying silent," Terrell had written. "It helps to know I'm not alone." David read that email 3 times. Then he opened a new document and started typing. The next morning, David woke up early. He'd barely slept, his mind too full of thoughts and questions. Rachel was still asleep beside him, her breathing soft and steady. He got up quietly and went downstairs to make coffee. His phone started ringing at 7 in the morning. It was Linda Hayes from the airline. "Dr. Roberts, I hope I'm not calling too early," she said. "I wanted to update you before the announcement goes public." David sat down at the kitchen table with his coffee. "I'm listening." "Jennifer Williams and Greg Patterson have been terminated, effective immediately. We've launched a comprehensive review of all our policies regarding passenger interactions and discrimination. We're bringing in outside consultants to overhaul our training programs, and we're establishing an independent oversight committee to review discrimination complaints." "That's good," David said. "What about the scholarship fund?" "Mr. Morrison has personally committed $5 million to establish the fund. We're calling it the Future of Aviation Scholarship Program, and it will provide full-ride scholarships to students of color pursuing careers in aviation, hospitality, and customer service. We'd like to name you as an honorary board member if you're willing." David felt a lump form in his throat. $5 million? "He's very serious about making this right," Linda said. "We're announcing everything at a press conference this afternoon. We'd like you to be there, but we understand if you prefer not to be." David thought about Terrell's email, about all the other people who'd experienced this kind of treatment and had no recourse, no justice, no voice. "I'll be there," he said, "but I want to speak. Not just stand in the background. We were hoping you'd say that." The press conference was held at the airline's headquarters downtown. David wore a suit, though he'd rather have worn jeans. Rachel and Kevin came with him, standing just off to the side of the podium. The room was packed with reporters, cameras, and lights. Robert Morrison, the CEO, spoke first. He didn't make excuses. He didn't minimize what had happened. He called it what it was: racial profiling, discrimination, a failure of the company's values and training. Then he introduced David. David stepped up to the microphone, and for a moment, the weight of all those eyes, all those cameras, all that attention felt crushing. But then he thought about what he'd written the night before, the words he'd spent hours crafting. He pulled out the folded paper from his jacket pocket. "My name is Dr. David Roberts," he began, his voice steady. "2 days ago I was told I didn't belong in the first-class seat I had paid for. I was threatened with removal, with being banned from an airline I'd flown with for years. And the only reason that happened was because of the color of my skin." He paused, looking around the room. "But here's what I want everyone to understand. The problem wasn't that those employees didn't recognize me as a doctor, or know that I'd once saved their CEO's life. The problem is that they saw a black man and made assumptions. They saw someone who didn't fit their image of who belongs in first class." David's hands gripped the sides of the podium. "I have degrees. I have credentials. I have awards and recognition. But none of that should matter when it comes to basic human dignity and respect. The black man sitting in economy class deserves the same respect I do. The woman wearing a hijab going through security deserves respect. The young Latino man in a hoodie deserves respect. We all do, regardless of our titles or our accomplishments." The room was completely silent except for the clicking of cameras. "I'm grateful that the airline is taking action," David continued. "I'm grateful for the scholarship fund that will help young people of color enter industries where representation matters. But I want to be clear about something. This isn't about one airline or 2 employees. This is about a system that allows bias to flourish, that makes assumptions about people based on their appearance, that treats some passengers like suspects rather than customers." He looked directly at the cameras. "If you're watching this and you've experienced something similar, I want you to know you're not alone. Your experience is valid, your anger is justified, and we need to keep speaking up until things actually change." David glanced at his prepared speech, then folded it back up. "I became a doctor because I wanted to help people, to save lives. But I've learned that sometimes saving lives means more than surgery. Sometimes it means using your voice when you have the platform to do so. Sometimes it means making noise instead of accepting quiet discrimination. He took a breath. So I'm making noise, and I hope others will join me. The questions from reporters came fast after that, but David answered each one thoughtfully. He talked about racial profiling in air travel, about implicit bias, about the importance of diverse hiring. He praised Captain Rodriguez and Kimberly Chen for standing up. He acknowledged the other passengers who had recorded what happened, making it impossible to sweep under the rug. When it was finally over, when the cameras stopped rolling and the reporters packed up their equipment, David felt exhausted but also lighter somehow, like he'd set down a weight he'd been carrying. In the car on the way home, Kevin looked at his phone and smiled. "Dad, you're trending on every platform. People are calling you a hero." David shook his head. "I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who refused to be quiet." "That's what makes you a hero," Rachel said softly, taking his hand. 3 months later, David received an email from Terrell, the young man who'd written to him after the incident. Terrell had applied for the scholarship fund and had been accepted. He was going to study aviation management and wanted to make sure that what happened to David would never happen to anyone else on his watch. David printed out the email and pinned it to the wall in his study, right next to his medical degree. Because sometimes the lives you save aren't the ones on the operating table. Sometimes they're the ones you inspire to make the world a little bit better. And that, David thought, was worth every difficult moment of speaking up.